back and says this individual has to be dealt with in a very strict way, stoned. And this is for the blaspheming of the name. Exactly what that entails, what you have to say in order for that to happen, not exactly sure. Doesn't go into detail. But it must have been significant enough that God comes back and says, this person has to die.
Is there two, I guess it says whoever curses his Elohim, and then it says that he shall bear his sin, and then he who blasphemes the name of the Lord shall be put to death. Is there you're talking about God versus the
No,
God?
I think I look at it as just saying, look, Elohim is a title, Yahweh is a specific. So I don't think it's trying to draw.
They're parallels, you're saying?
Yeah, the parallels. I don't think it's trying to draw a contrast. Because you could say he's my Elohim or he's Yahweh.
Yeah.
So it would work either way. And we see that throughout the scriptures where you can go back and forth between the two. 1 and 2, right here first sitting, and then
If you hit your thumb with a hammer, are you blaspheming God or you're condemning the nail?
I don't think this is because of the way it's worded. I don't believe that it's about a curse word, like you say a curse word. I think the lifting up of the name is to take the name, to take an oath in the name of God, to call God to witness an oath in which the person taking the oath has no intention of keeping the oath, but you're asking God to be a witness to it. So you're saying, as the Lord lives, may such and such happen. And yet in your mind, look, I have no intention of doing this, but yet I'm asking God to be a witness to it. And you're lifting up his name in this oath. Primarily it's an oath taking.
But one more thing then, in Revelations, when the bowls of God's wrath are poured out, it says, and they cursed God.
Mm-hmm.
They cursed his name and the name of those that dwell in heaven.
So I think it could also, again, the specifics of it are not given to us, but it could incorporate that as well. Dan?
Well, you've talked about this before. When something's repeated twice, it's reinforcing it. It may use different words to say the same thing, but it'll say it 2 times, and another scripture will say 2 times to say, basically reinforcing what was said before.
Sure. In regard to...
Well, we were talking...
about Elohim
It's been over 5 minutes. I forgot my original thought.
Okay. All right. Good.
I'm noticing at the beginning how many times they talked about the man's mother. So it's kind of important that we teach our children not to curse the name of God.
Yeah, he's mixed. This individual is mixed parentage. So it's interesting that because of that, there seems to be maybe one of the parents was not as scrupulous in training the child as the other parent was. If parents don't work together, you end up with some problems, and perhaps in this situation it's kind of drawing attention to that. Perhaps. I'm not being dogmatic on that, but hold on 1 second. You're next.
Doesn't it follow through with what I've heard in the past is it's making it common, making God's name common is where that making it, saying
Sure.
his name in vain.
Right.
Like the family situation there. He was just throwing it out there like it was no big deal, and correlating with any other thing. It's more serious than that.
Yeah, I think there has to be something more serious than just hitting his thumbnail and saying, okay. But I mean, it's more than just that. It's an expletive. I think it's something much more serious than that, just by the nature of what happens to him. Okay.
So, thinking about why would they put in there the fact that this guy's dad was an Egyptian, right?
Yeah.
There's just have to be some relevance to that.
There is, and that's what I'm saying.
So what if it was, and I have a martial arts instructor who talks about, he says, when you see 2 guys about to get into a fight, he says they start with the monkey dance, where they start bouncing the chest and talking smack to each other, and he says, so I'm thinking here, maybe it's this guy whose father was an Egyptian says, I'm going to kick your butt in the name of my God who's better than your God.
Maybe it's something like that.
Could it be something of that?
Could be something.
Why would they bother to mention that his dad was an Egyptian? I don't know what difference would it make.
Yeah, I think that's why I said earlier. I think there is something to the fact that there's mixed parentage. That because of that mixed parentage, somehow the idea of maybe he heard his father curse Yahweh, and so it's like, hey, I can treat this God any way I want to because God doesn't take him seriously.
Because they have many gods.
Yeah,
Right.
right. So
Well,
it's
if
like,
we take the word curse and I think we don't know how to define it according to biblical definition.
and I think that's why I'm saying
Because
that.
we think curse is an S word or an F
Right,
bomb.
right. No, I think in this instance, by the language, to lift up the name is to possibly treat it lightly. That's one possibility. The other thing is that you're entering oaths, you're taking an oath, and you're invoking the name of God without the intention of carrying through on your promise, on your word. But you're asking God to be there as a witness, and he's saying, look, because what happens is when you invoke my name and you have no intention of doing it, what that does is it brings reproach on me. Because then they say, well, you're quoting his name, you're using his name, and yet you have no intention of doing what you say. So it reflects badly on me. Yeah.
And could that be something as simple as saying, yes, I'm a believer, and then going out and sinning?
I don't know, that's a tough one. That's
If under the category of actions speak louder than words,
yeah.
you might say that that's
Yeah.
certainly
Oh,
an expression.
This seems to be a little more formalized in the sense that you've actually said some words. You're actually,
Well, it's like if Netanyahu says, we own the land because it's ours, because God said so, and someone else says, no, God didn't say that.
right, okay.
That would be, boom, direct confrontation.
Okay, that's a different category, but all right, hold on, I gotta, give me a chance here, because if not, we're gonna,
One more thing.
okay.
Would that be like in the case of the Muslims when they're going to do a suicide bombing or something, they cry out Allah Akbar, which they're saying that their God is the greatest.
Right.
They're demeaning the God of heaven, our creator.
That could play into this as well, I suppose. Yeah, I suppose that's possible. Henry, go ahead.
I'm just going to say, we go back to number one. So the name is important. But in verse 2, it says, I am Yahweh, your God, who has brought you out from the land of Egypt, from the house of bondage. Some believe that is the first commandment.
Right, some believe that's the first commandment, right. So I would,
Because if we don't know God,
right,
the rest of it is
right. Here's why I'm not inclined to see that as the first commandment, although others are. If you look at ancient, and I didn't bring these with me, but we've looked at them in the past. If you look at how other ancient Near Eastern documents are composed, there's a form. And in this form, you have an introductory clause that says why you should worship such and such God. So it would be something like, I'm the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt to be your God. So you would say, the reason why you should worship him is because I brought you out of Egypt. I delivered you. And therefore, since I delivered you, you're mine. So in ancient Near Eastern covenantal forms, we find a similar type of phraseology where a particular king or somebody writing on behalf of a god will say, I so-and-so, such brought you and did this for you, and therefore you owe me your allegiance. And then go on to say, here's what I want you to do. So I see it as a little more introductory in the sense of here's why you need to do all this stuff. But you're right that there are those who take it to be part of the first. So, all right, so the Sabbath. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. Go with me to Numbers chapter 15. Numbers chapter 15. Look at verse 32. Numbers chapter 15, verse 32 to 36. We're going to see a violation of the Sabbath. Verse 32 here says this. Now while the children of Israel were in the wilderness, they found a man gathering sticks on the Sabbath day. And those who found him gathering sticks brought him to Moses and Aaron and to all the congregation. They put him under guard because it had not been explained what should be done to him. Then the Lord said to Moses, the man must surely be put to death. All the congregation shall stone him with stones outside the camp. So, as the Lord commanded Moses, all the congregation brought him outside the camp and stoned him with stones, and he died. Okay? There's the narrative example of somebody violating the Sabbath, and the capital punishment is attached. He's picking up sticks. The question is, what exactly is this guy doing? Let me suggest this possibility. That the reason why this one is so important is because, number one, it's one of the first violations we see in the Sabbath. And oftentimes God goes harsh on the first offender. You go harsh on the first offender to send a message. Because if you go light on the first offender, people think, well,
Let it be.
pretty much get away with this. Also, this individual seems to be out there doing this in a way that's kind of like, you know what, I can get away with this. I don't think God's serious about all this. And again, they sequester him to ask God, okay, what do you want to do with him? God says, this kind of individual has to be put to death because, in a sense, they have blatantly and in a high-handed way shaken their fist at me to see if I will be serious about the Sabbath. And so, in this instance, the word comes back to Moses. Moses, the congregation needs to stone this individual. That's the breaking of the Sabbath. Now we come to the fifth commandment, which is honor your father and your mother. Notice what the text doesn't say. I've mentioned this before. It doesn't say love your father and mother. It says honor them. And we'll get to that, what that means in a moment. It says honor your father and your mother. The ancient Near East, if you look at other ancient Near Eastern documents, they did not talk about honoring your mother. They talked about honoring your father. So some people say the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is misogynist. He hates women. I don't think so, because if you look at this commandment, it says you have to honor your father and your mother, not just your father, unlike other ancient Near Eastern documents. Now look at what's said here. Go with me to Deuteronomy chapter 21. Deuteronomy chapter 21. Here's the text that speaks of the breaking or the dishonoring of one's parents. Look at Deuteronomy chapter 21 and verse 18 to 21. It says, now this is hypothetical. Now we move from actual breaking of commandments with the man who picks up sticks on the Sabbath and with the one who blasphemes the name. Those are actual cases. Here we become hypothetical. If a man, verse 18 of Deuteronomy 21, if a man has a stubborn and rebellious son who will not obey the voice of his father or the voice of his mother, and who, when they have chastened him, will not heed them, then his father and his mother shall take hold of him and bring him out to the elders of the city, to the gate of his city, and they shall say to the elders of his city, this son of ours is stubborn and rebellious. He will not obey our voice. He is a glutton and a drunkard. Then all the men of his city shall stone him to death with stones. So shall you put away the evil from among you, and all Israel shall hear and fear. So, this instance, here's what happens when a mother or father are not honored, when they're not obeyed. While you're living under their roof, to honor your father and mother is to be obedient to them, unless they ask you to do something illegal, immoral, or unethical. So unless they ask you to do something in one of those three categories, you have the obligation to be obedient to them. Once you move outside your mother and father's house, your obligation to your mother and father is to make sure that they have their clothing, their food, and are protected from the elements. Then you have fulfilled your role as one who honors. Yes?
One of the things that we got to remember about in the Bible is, like the Ten Commandments, in the Old Testament they're mentioned 3 times, Exodus, Deuteronomy, and Leviticus, excuse me. And this one that Brent just read is also reinforced in the Proverbs.
Yes.
And one other place, and I can't remember where the other place was, so if Yehovah is mentioned at one time, it's important. If he mentions it twice, it's really important. If he mentions it 3 times, it's very, very, very important.
Doctrine.
And the command is, Shema means to hear and obey.
Right. And why this particular commandment is linchpin for this reason. Children will learn to be obedient to God by being obedient to parents. It's almost comparable in this regard. Show me a child who has difficulty bending the knee to parents, I'll demonstrate a child who probably has difficulty bending the knee to God. Show me a child who submits to their parents. I'll show you a child who more than likely submits to God.
Brent,
Yes.
I'm sure that everybody else is like me, but I swore that my mother had eyes in the back of her head.
She did.
But God sees us all the time.
Yes. Yes, very much so. Yes.
I know people have asked in the past, if they, let's say they had an abusive parent, a father who beat them. And it's really hard for anyone because you figure, who's your example of God? I mean, when you're a child.
Right.
And if your father is mistreating you, well, I'm not going to, then God's going to do the same thing.
Right.
That's a real hard thing.
And I think kids often make that kind of transference because the individuals who should have at every moment a child's best interest are always parents. At every moment. And so there are times, and you're absolutely right, where we have, because of the world we live in, parents who violate trust in the highest ways. I don't understand, I'm being honest with you to say this, I don't understand parents who pummel their children and beat them. And yet we know that happens. I don't understand parents who have sexual relations with their children. They see their children as an object of their sexual expression. That's messed up. It does damage. There are parents who verbally abuse their children all the time. They put them down all the time with their language. And they verbally pummel their children.
Neglect.
Through neglect. They just leave their children and they go off. And they're not even around them. And when the children need them, they're nowhere to be found. So yeah, you have neglect, you have abuse, you have verbal abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, and in those instances, it's completely humanly understandable why they have trouble wanting to be around their parents. Absolutely. However, I would say this. If you are redeemed and you are one who is saved, one who is in the family of God, I would hope that even if you have the worst mother and or father in the world, that you can find a way to at least give them food, clothing, and shelter. I'm not saying you've got to buy them a new car. I'm not saying you've got to set them up with a huge bank account. I'm not saying you've got to do all that other stuff. But I am saying biblically, the basic necessities that any human being would have, food, clothing, and shelter. And you don't have to like them. You don't have to love them. The text simply says you have to honor them as another human being. Even if they didn't treat you like a human being. And I will admit, I've known situations where trying to make this happen is extremely, extremely difficult. Because at some point, you have to find a way to forgive. And let me make this point. When we talk about forgiveness, I'm not saying by forgiving another person that you're saying that what they did was right. Forgiveness is not about saying that what another person did was right. Forgiveness is saying this: I will release my desire and my willingness and my want to exact punishment upon you, and I will leave it in the hand of God to judge you and to deal with you the way He sees fit. It's not about saying, I think what you did was right. That's not what forgiveness is. Because in many situations, the things they have done are not right. I told you, many of you, I'm dealing with a situation right now where I have a PayPal account, which is an account you can have to write prisoners. Started by a Jewish man, so it was called Jewish Pay. Initially, now it's called JPay. Jewish man started this idea that people could send emails to prisoners. So it's one of the ways I keep up with a number of different inmates across the state of Washington. I've shared this with you guys before. There was a pastor in this area. Who has sexual relations with his young children. And I find that absolutely abhorrent. It's the absolute most vile violation of parental trust that you can do. And he was a pastor of a local church in this area. He and I would meet for lunch. And it was through the grapevine that I heard that he had been deposed, taken out of his job, and then put in prison. And he writes me from prison to say, hey, will you talk with me? Will you interact with me? And I must confess to you that my initial thoughts were, I don't really want anything to do with you. I find what you did so reviling and so repulsive that it turns my stomach to think of what you did and the violation of trust that you did. And I must confess to you that that's still some things that go on in my head, and but yet I moved beyond that somewhat to where we now have conversations and we're talking and we're dialoguing back and forth. And I admit to you,
but it's only by the grace of God that that's happened.
Yeah.
yes, because I can't. And here's what's interesting. He said to me this, and again, I'm not making excuses because there's no excuse for this. But he says to me in a letter, he says, the same thing that I did to my kids happened to me. That doesn't excuse it. That doesn't excuse it one bit. But here's the thing. The sins of the fathers often come back and become the sins of the fathers. And somebody has to choose to somebody has to make the conscious choice to break the cycle. To say, you know what, I will not do that. Just because my father and or mother did this, I will choose to break the cycle of doing that to my children. Just because, like my own father broke a cycle. His brothers were physically beaten by their father. And his father had been beaten by his father. They thought that this was an acceptable form of punishment. That you could literally take your fist and hit your child in the face to the point of knocking them out. And having them with a bloody lip and a bloody nose. And knocked out. This was some type of legitimate form of punishment. So my father ran away from home. And his brothers have issues because of the way they were treated by their father. And my father made the conscious choice to say, you know what, we'll break that cycle. I'm not going to do that to my son. Let me say this, because this is a big issue in the news, issues of corporate punishment. Because rebellion has to be dealt with. The Torah talks about, Proverbs talks about dealing with rebellion. Let me say this though. From my perspective, never should a parent, my perspective, never should a parent ever hit a child in the face.
Amen.
Never. I don't have a problem if you do this, or even that. The meaty part of the bony part of the hand. But there's something dehumanizing and something that creates all kinds of animosity if you slap a child or hit a child in the face. Because there's something about the face that is your humanity. Okay, so just thinking out loud here, so I'm just saying, that's not an area to hit a child. Ever. Comments or questions? Yes.
Not only a child, but a woman, the same thing.
I agree.
Never
Absolutely.
calculating. Anything that is weaker than you.
True.
You just
Absolutely.
don't do things like that.
Absolutely. Yeah. No call for that. All right, so we got to move on. Oh my stars. We're not going to get through all these. It doesn't look like.
Choose your favorite.
Yeah. Okay.
Skip the less important ones.
Well, they're all important. Yeah.
Suggestions.
Did you
What are the changes going?
These other commandments were just kind of ideas. So let me give you the references. Let me give you the references. Here we go. I'm putting them in this order. Stealing. Joshua chapter 6, verses 18 to 19. Joshua chapter 6, verses 18 to 19. And then read chapter 7, verses 1 to 11. This is where the man named Achan steals a Babylonian garment and a wedge of gold and some silver shekels from the town of Jericho. He steals, and everything in that town, everything in Jericho, was under what is called cherem, the ban. Cherem. It was dedicated and devoted to God for destruction. Any time in the Bible that we see individuals killed instantly, it's because they have stolen or touched. And by the way, they've stolen if you touch something that belongs to God, that's holy. Even if you touch it and benefit from that touch, God strikes you instantly. Let me give you a couple examples. Uzzah touching the ark. Nadab and Abihu in the holy place. Ananias and Sapphira.
Yep.
Bam. Okay? God judges instantly and quickly. And no recourse. So Achan steals because Jericho was first fruits of the land of Canaan. And it's all under cherem, it's all under the ban. You can't touch it. And I'm sure that Achan thought to himself, oh, this seems like a colossal waste. We're going to just destroy all this stuff? We're just going to burn it all up? Nobody's going to miss a Babylonian garment, a couple shekels of silver, and a little wedge of gold. Nobody will even know. God said, hey, you just stole from me. All right. Moving on. Murder. It doesn't say killing. It says murder. Because there are 5 types of killing, if I can put it in those terms, that the Bible at least allows for. There's no capital punishment for it necessarily. Self-defense. Defense of your home. Capital offense, where we corporately work together to rid the world of those that God has told us to. Negligence. Negligence, although you can be held responsible if you should have. Let me show you the difference between negligence and accidental. The fifth one's accidental. Accidental is this. This happens all the time during hunting season. 2 guys go out hunting, and they both have their rifles, and they split up. No decision, but they do it. Then one of them hears a rustling in the trees, in the bushes, and he shoots. And he shoots his partner. That's accidental. There was no malice aforethought. Negligence is where you have a